The stone wall that had seemed so solid 3 hours ago now felt paper-thin against Audie Murphy's back as another artillery round shook dust from the farmhouse eaves. Through the gap in the mortar, he could see the abandoned tank destroyer sitting at the crossroads like a metal gravestone, its turret twisted at an unnatural angle, but its hull-mounted machine gun still pointing down the approach road. The crew had bailed out during the first German probe at dawn, leaving behind their steel coffin and a perfect firing position that no sane man would occupy. Murphy shifted his rifle against the weathered stone, feeling the January cold seep through his wool gloves. The Vosges Mountains stretched endlessly around their isolated position, pine forests heavy with snow that muffled sound and turned every shadow into a potential threat. His squad had been holding this crossroads for 18 hours, watching German patrols test their defenses while waiting for orders that might never come. The radio crackled with distant voices coordinating retreats and requesting artillery support that wasn't available. Private Johnson appeared at Murphy's elbow, his young face tight with exhaustion. The kid had been cleaning his rifle obsessively since the first shells started falling, a nervous habit that reminded Murphy of his own early days with the 3rd Infantry Division. "Sergeant Williams says the Germans are massing in the tree line again," Johnson whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. "Same spot they came from last time, maybe 50 of them." Murphy nodded, keeping his eyes on the tank destroyer's hulking silhouette. The burned-out vehicle dominated the crossroads like a steel monument to the morning's failed advance, its blackened armor scarred by the Panzerfaust that had knocked it out of action. But the hull gun remained intact, and Murphy found himself calculating angles and fields of fire with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through Sicily, Anzio, and the long push through France. "Tell Williams I'm going to take a closer look," Murphy said, already moving toward the farmhouse cellar where their wounded lay hidden beneath blankets and hope. The sound of his boots on frozen ground seemed impossibly loud, but the German observers were still 300 yards away, content to watch and wait for their artillery to finish the job. Murphy had seen this pattern before: probe, withdraw, shell, repeat, until the defenders broke or died. Corporal Martinez looked up from bandaging a soldier's arm as Murphy descended into the cellar's dim warmth. "How long do you think we can hold, Murphy?" The question hung in the stale air like incense in a church, heavy with unspoken implications. Martinez had been with the unit since North Africa, long enough to recognize the mathematics of their situation. "Long enough," Murphy replied, though both men understood the calculation. 12 soldiers against an estimated company of German infantry, with limited ammunition and no prospect of reinforcement before nightfall. The wounded couldn't be moved, and someone had to buy time for the evacuation routes to clear. Murphy touched the St. Christopher medal in his pocket, a habit that had become more frequent as his reputation grew and the odds against survival mounted. The radio in Williams's pack suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static and distant voices. Orders to fall back to the next ridge, coordinates for artillery support that wouldn't arrive for hours, and casualty reports from other units scattered across the Vosges. Murphy listened to the mechanical recitation of positions lost and men wounded, understanding that his small command had been forgotten in the larger chaos of winter warfare. When the German assault finally came, it arrived with the methodical precision Murphy had learned to respect and fear. Machine gun fire raked the farmhouse walls while mortar rounds began walking toward their position, each explosion closer than the last. Murphy moved through the building like a ghost, appearing at different windows to return measured fire, creating the illusion of a larger defensive force than his handful of exhausted soldiers. The tank destroyer sat in the crossroads like a challenge, its hull gun pointing directly down the German approach route. Murphy found himself studying the abandoned vehicle with new interest, calculating the sprint across open ground and the shelter its armor might provide. Crazy thinking, perhaps, but no crazier than trying to hold an impossible position with impossible odds. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The morning wore on, with the grinding persistence of winter warfare in the Vosges Mountains, each German probe slightly more aggressive than the last. Murphy watched from his position behind the stone wall as enemy soldiers moved between the snow-laden pines, their white camouflage making them appear and disappear like ghosts in the mountain mist. The abandoned tank destroyer continued to dominate the crossroads, its hull machine gun trained on the main approach route like an accusation against the crew that had abandoned it. Sergeant Williams crawled over to Murphy's position, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that came from 3 campaigns and too many friends lost. "They're bringing up mortars," he reported, pointing toward a depression in the tree line where German soldiers were digging positions. "Figure maybe 20 minutes before they start dropping rounds on us, systematic-like." Murphy nodded, his attention divided between the immediate tactical problem and the strange pull he felt toward the burned-out tank destroyer. The vehicle's hull gun remained operational. He could see the ammunition belt hanging from its breech, but reaching it would require a sprint across 50 yards of open ground under enemy observation. Military doctrine called it suicide. Murphy's instinct suggested it might be the only way to break up the German assault before it overran their thin defensive line. Private Johnson returned from checking their ammunition supply, his young face reflecting the grim arithmetic of their situation. 47 rounds for the bar, maybe 60 for the rifles, he reported. Martinez says the wounded are stable, but they can't be moved. The unspoken question hung between them. How long could they make their ammunition last against a company-strength assault? The radio crackled with fragmentary reports from other units scattered across the Vosges sector. A company falling back from Hill 351, another requesting medical evacuation that wouldn't arrive until the roads cleared. Murphy listened to the disembodied voices with growing understanding that his small command had become an afterthought in the larger battle, a squad-size problem that higher command expected to resolve itself one way or another. German voices echoed through the forest as their assault force continued to grow. Murphy counted at least 6 distinct machine gun positions, with mortars being positioned to support their advance. The enemy had time and numbers. Murphy had desperate men and an impossible position to hold. The mathematics were simple enough that even Johnson could read them in Williams's grim expression. "They're not going to wait much longer," Williams observed, studying the German positions through a gap in the farmhouse wall. "Figure they'll come hard and fast, try to overrun us before we can call in artillery." So both men knew that artillery support wasn't coming, that their radio requests had disappeared into the chaos of a winter offensive that was stalling in the mountain snow. Murphy found his gaze returning to the tank destroyer, its hull gun pointing like a finger of accusation at the German assembly area. The crew had abandoned their vehicle after taking a Panzerfaust hit to the turret, but the hull-mounted machine gun remained intact and loaded. Reaching it would require crossing open ground under enemy fire, but the psychological impact of that gun opening up might disrupt the German assault long enough for his men to hold their position. The moral calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Stay behind cover and watch his wounded men get overrun or take an impossible risk to buy them time. Murphy had faced similar decisions before, but never with stakes quite so personal. These weren't statistics in an after-action report. They were faces he knew, men who trusted him to find a way through the impossible. As the German assault preparations intensified, Murphy began moving his men into their final defensive positions. Williams took the bar to the farmhouse's upper floor, while Johnson and Martinez prepared to cover the approaches from the cellar windows. Each man understood their role in what was likely to be their last battle, but none questioned Murphy's quiet confidence that they would find a way to hold. The tank destroyer waited in the crossroads like a steel promise, its hull gun pointing toward salvation or destruction. Murphy checked his rifle one last time, counting his remaining ammunition and calculating the distance to that abandoned fighting position. In 20 minutes, he would discover whether courage was enough to bridge the gap between impossible odds and miraculous survival. The German mortar rounds began falling at exactly 10:15, their methodical progression walking toward the farmhouse with the precision Murphy had learned to fear most. Each explosion sent frozen earth and stone fragments spinning through the air, while the concussion waves rattled the remaining windows in their frames. From his position behind the stone wall, Murphy watched the tank destroyer absorb several near misses, its hull armor ringing like a bell but remaining intact. Williams's voice carried down from the farmhouse's upper floor, calling out German positions as the enemy assault force continued to mass in the tree line. "Two machine gun teams moving to flank positions," he reported, his tone matter-of-fact despite the implications. "They're setting up to catch us in crossfire when they come." The Vosges Mountains that had provided such beautiful scenery during their advance now offered perfect concealment for an enemy that had all the time in the world. Private Johnson appeared at Murphy's side, his young face reflecting the controlled terror that came with understanding the mathematics of their situation. "Sergeant Murphy," he whispered, using the formal address that soldiers employed when they needed to believe their leaders had answers to impossible questions. "What are we going to do?" The question carried weight beyond tactics. It was a plea for hope in circumstances that offered very little. Murphy studied the abandoned tank destroyer with growing conviction that the burned-out vehicle represented their only chance of survival. The hull machine gun commanded the main approach route, and its psychological impact on the German assault might buy enough time for relief to arrive. The crew had fled after taking the Panzerfaust hit, but the hull gun's ammunition belt remained intact, visible even from their defensive position. "I'm going to take that tank destroyer," Murphy said quietly, his words carrying the finality of a man who had already made his choice. Johnson's eyes widened with understanding of what such a move would require, a sprint across 50 yards of open ground under enemy observation, followed by a one-man stand in a position that had already claimed one crew. The radio crackled with fragmentary reports from across the Vosges sector, companies falling back to secondary positions, artillery requests that couldn't be fulfilled, casualty evacuations delayed by road conditions. Murphy listened to the mechanical recitation of military disasters, with growing understanding that his small command had been written off in the larger calculation of winter warfare. They were expendable mathematics in a campaign that measured success in ridgelines held and divisions preserved. Corporal Martinez emerged from the cellar, carrying the last of their medical supplies, his expression grim with the knowledge that came from tending wounded men in impossible circumstances. "The boys downstairs are asking questions," he reported. "They know we're not getting out of this easy." The unspoken question hung between them. How much truth should dying men be told about their chances? German voices grew closer as their assault force completed its preparations. Murphy could distinguish individual commands echoing through the forest, officers coordinating the attack that would sweep over their thin defensive line in minutes rather than hours. The enemy had numbers, time, and fire superiority. Murphy had desperate men and a half-formed plan that violated every tactical principle he'd ever learned. "When I move for that tank destroyer," Murphy told his men, his voice carrying across the farmhouse's defensive positions, "give me covering fire for 30 seconds, then concentrate on your own sectors. Don't follow me. That hull gun can only protect one man, and you're needed here." The orders were clear enough, but Murphy could see the protest forming in Williams's weathered features. The moral weight of command settled on Murphy's shoulders like winter snow, cold and accumulating with each passing minute. His men trusted him to find impossible solutions to lethal problems, to transform desperate stands into miraculous survivals. The tank destroyer offered a chance to fulfill that trust, but only if he could reach it alive and operate its hull gun effectively enough to disrupt the German assault. As enemy mortar fire intensified and German assault teams moved into their final positions, Murphy prepared for the sprint that would either save his men or kill him trying. The abandoned tank destroyer sat in the crossroads like a steel altar, waiting for someone with enough courage or foolishness to claim its protection and turn its gun against the approaching enemy. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy's sprint across the frozen crossroads happened in that strange slow-motion clarity that combat veterans would recognize but never adequately describe to those who hadn't felt bullets cutting the air around them. German machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions as he left the farmhouse's protection, muzzle flashes winking through the forest like deadly fireflies. Behind him, Williams opened up with the bar from the upper window, his covering fire walking across the enemy positions with professional precision. The tank destroyer's hull loomed larger with each step, its blackened armor scarred by the morning's violence, but still offering protection that no foxhole could match. Murphy dove behind the vehicle's tracks just as a burst of machine gun fire sparked off the road where he'd been running, his heart hammering against his ribs with the particular terror that came from crossing open ground under fire. The Vosges Mountains seemed to echo with the sound of gunfire, each shot magnified by the winter air until the entire world became noise and fear. Inside the tank destroyer's hull, Murphy found the machine gun exactly as the crew had left it, loaded, operational, and pointing down the main German approach route like a steel finger of divine intervention. The ammunition belt hung ready, and the gun's traverse mechanism responded smoothly to his touch. Through the hull's vision ports, he could see German assault teams rising from their concealment, finally confident that the abandoned vehicle posed no threat to their advance. The psychological shock of the hull gun opening fire rippled through the German assault force like a stone thrown into still water. Murphy's first burst caught a machine gun team completely exposed, their confident advance suddenly transformed into desperate scrambling for cover that no longer existed. The sound of the heavy machine gun echoed off the mountain slopes, its deep voice adding bass notes to the higher-pitched crack of rifle fire from the farmhouse. German mortar rounds began falling around the tank destroyer with renewed intensity, each near miss ringing the hull like a bell and filling the crew compartment with the acrid smoke of high explosives. Murphy traversed the hull gun methodically, breaking up each German assault attempt before it could gain momentum. The enemy had numbers and time, but Murphy had position and the devastating firepower of a weapon designed to stop infantry attacks exactly like this one. The battle developed into a deadly chess match, with German squad leaders probing for weaknesses while Murphy anticipated their movements with the tactical instinct that had kept him alive through 3 campaigns. Each burst from the hull gun disrupted enemy timing, forcing the Germans to seek new approaches while his men in the farmhouse maintained their defensive fire from protected positions. The abandoned tank destroyer had become the linchpin of their defense, transforming an impossible stand into a sustainable battle. Through the vision ports, Murphy watched German soldiers dragging their wounded back into the forest, their assault momentum broken by the unexpected resistance from what should have been an abandoned position. The hull gun's ammunition belt shortened with each burst, but enemy pressure decreased proportionally as German commanders reassessed their attack plan in light of this new tactical reality. Private Johnson's voice reached him through the chaos, the young soldier's shouts barely audible over the gunfire, but clear enough to understand. "They're pulling back! The whole line's falling back!" Murphy continued firing measured bursts into the tree line, denying the Germans any opportunity to reorganize their assault or establish new firing positions. The tank destroyer's armor absorbed enemy fire like a stone breakwater, each impact a reminder of how exposed his sprint across the crossroads had been. The Vosges mountains gradually fell silent as the German assault force withdrew to reconsider their options. Murphy remained at the hull gun, watching the forest through smoke-stained vision ports while his hands shook with the adrenaline aftermath that followed close combat. The tank destroyer had become his fortress and his prison, protecting him from enemy fire while isolating him from the men whose lives depended on his continued resistance. From the farmhouse, William's voice carried across the crossroads with professional admiration and personal concern. "Murphy, you okay in there?" The question carried weight beyond immediate tactics. It was an acknowledgement that what Murphy had just accomplished fell outside normal parameters of courage and into something approaching the miraculous. The burned-out tank destroyer had become a symbol of impossible odds overcome through individual will. What the after-action report would never capture, what Murphy could never explain to the officers who would later pin medals on his chest, was the 17 minutes he spent alone in that tank destroyer's hull, while German snipers tested his position and his own mind tested the boundaries of sanity. The hull gun had fallen silent, not from lack of ammunition, but because there were no more targets worth the risk of revealing his exact position to enemy observers who were learning to work around his field of fire. Murphy sat in the crew compartment's dim interior, surrounded by the personal effects the original crew had left behind. A photograph of someone's sweetheart tucked behind a vision block, a half-eaten chocolate bar, and a letter written in handwriting he would remember for decades afterward. The German artillery had shifted to other targets, but the psychological weight of isolation pressed against him like water against a submarine hull, threatening to crush something essential in his mind. The secret that would haunt Murphy's sleep for years afterward wasn't his courage under fire. It was the moment during those 17 minutes when he found himself talking to the photograph behind the vision block, carrying on a conversation with a dead tanker's girlfriend about whether her boyfriend had suffered when the Panzerfaust penetrated their armor. The Vosges mountains seemed to lean inward around the crossroads, creating a pocket of silence that amplified every small sound until Murphy could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the hull walls. German voices approached and retreated as enemy patrols probed the tank destroyer's flanks, testing whether the hull gun was still manned or had been abandoned like so many other positions during the winter campaign. Murphy remained perfectly still, his finger resting on the trigger while sweat froze on his forehead in the January cold. The machine gun's barrel had cooled enough to frost over, creating a thin film of ice that would shatter with the first shot. Through the hull's vision ports, Murphy watched a German soldier creep close enough to touch the tank destroyer's tracks, the enemy's face clearly visible beneath his winter camouflage. For 30 seconds, the two men existed within arm's reach of each other, separated only by steel armor and the arbitrary mathematics of war that had placed them on opposite sides of the same terrifying moment. The German moved on without discovering Murphy's presence, but his face would return in dreams for years afterward. The radio in Murphy's pack crackled with distant voices coordinating relief efforts and casualty evacuations from across the Vosges sector. His own position had been written off hours ago, classified as contact lost in reports that reduced his men's desperate stand to a single line in a situation map. Murphy listened to the mechanical voices with growing understanding that survival had become a personal matter, divorced from larger strategic calculations that measured success in divisions rather than squads. When German machine guns finally opened fire on the farmhouse again, Murphy emerged from his strange isolation to man the hull gun with renewed purpose. Each burst was carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact while conserving ammunition that couldn't be replaced. The tank destroyer's position allowed him to catch German assault teams in enfilade, disrupting their attacks before they could develop momentum against his men's defensive positions. The true weight of those 17 minutes wouldn't settle on Murphy until years later, when the smell of diesel fuel or the sound of tracked vehicles would trigger memories of talking to a dead man's photograph while German soldiers walked close enough to kill him with a hand grenade. The medal citations would mention his tactical brilliance and sustained courage, but they would remain silent about the conversation he'd carried on with ghosts in a burned-out tank destroyer. Corporal Martinez's voice reached him across the crossroads as German fire slackened again. "Murphy, relief columns on the road!" The words carried hope and reprieve, but also the knowledge that Murphy's strange vigil in the tank destroyer was approaching its end. The hull gun had served its purpose, transforming an impossible defensive stand into a survivable battle through firepower and psychological warfare that no tactical manual had ever described. As the sound of American vehicles echoed through the Vosges valleys, Murphy prepared to abandon his steel fortress and return to the company of living men. But part of him would remain forever in that hull compartment, talking to photographs and listening for footsteps that might belong to enemies or friends. The relief column that finally reached their position consisted of 3 Sherman tanks and a platoon of infantry who approached the farmhouse with the cautious respect that soldiers reserved for positions that had seen too much fighting. Murphy emerged from the tank destroyer's hull like a man surfacing from deep water, his movements careful and deliberate as he reconnected with a world that felt subtly different than the one he had left 50 yards and several lifetimes earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the battalion commander who would later write Murphy's citation, stood beside the crossroads, studying the tactical situation with professional interest that couldn't quite conceal his amazement. The German withdrawal had been complete and hasty, leaving behind equipment and ammunition that suggested a much larger defensive force than the handful of soldiers Harrison found alive in the farmhouse ruins. "How many men did you have?" Harrison asked, his tone carrying the disbelief of someone recalculating impossible mathematics. 12, Murphy replied, his voice carrying across the Vosges winter air with a flatness that would characterize all his future descriptions of the action. Started with 12. D. The numbers told their own story to experienced officers who understood the arithmetic of small unit combat, but Harrison's expression suggested that some equations produced results that defied reasonable explanation. Sergeant Williams appeared from the farmhouse carrying their wounded, his weathered face reflecting a combination of relief and something approaching awe as he watched Murphy walk away from the tank destroyer. "Never seen anything like it," he told the relief force medics, his voice carrying the particular reverence that combat veterans reserve for actions that transcended normal courage. "That boy held them off for 4 hours from inside that death trap." The after-action report that Harrison would file 3 days later transformed Murphy's desperate improvisation into clean, tactical language that emphasized firepower and position rather than the psychological isolation that had nearly broken him during those 17 minutes of silence. Military bureaucracy required heroes who fit established categories, not young men who talked to photographs while German soldiers walked close enough to touch their hiding places. Private Johnson, his arm bandaged but his spirit intact, helped load the wounded into medical vehicles while stealing glances at Murphy with the expression soldiers wore when they witnessed something that would require years to fully understand. "You think they'll believe us when we tell them what happened here?" he asked Martinez, his question carrying weight beyond simple after-action reporting into the realm of legend and memory. The Vosges Mountains settled into winter quiet as American forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the next phase of operations that would eventually carry them across the Rhine. Murphy's small action at the crossroads would merit 3 paragraphs in the division history, but the tank destroyer would remain in his dreams for decades afterward. its hull compartment forever populated by ghosts and conversations that medals couldn't acknowledge. Years later, when reporters asked Murphy about his most memorable combat action, he would consistently deflect attention from individual heroics toward the collective courage of men who held impossible positions because retreat wasn't an option. But sometimes, when diesel fumes mixed with winter air, he would find himself back in that tank destroyer's hull, talking to a photograph and listening for footsteps that belonged to either salvation or death. The Medal of Honor citation would eventually describe Murphy's action as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, language that captured the external facts while remaining silent about the internal cost of such moments. The real weight would settle on Murphy gradually, not in the explosive minutes of combat, but in the quiet decades afterward, when memory proved more persistent than enemy fire. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.